My friends, how many of you today feel lost? How many wake up in the morning dreading the day ahead? You go to work, you sit at a desk, you build, you serve, you labor, but deep inside you wonder, is this all there is? You see, we live in a world where work has become just a paycheck, just a duty, just another thing to get through. People say, if I just had another job, I'd be happy. Or if I could retire early, then I'd find peace. But let me tell you something, friends. Your purpose is not found in running away from work. Your purpose is found in bringing God into it. The trouble with so many of us today is that we've allowed the world to tell us what work is supposed to be. We've let society convince us that work is a burden, something to endure until we can finally escape it. We've bought into the idea that fulfillment comes only after the work is done, that we just have to push through the grind long enough to reach the weekend or vacation or retirement. But what if I told you that work was never meant to be something you suffer through? What if I told you that work, in its very essence, is meant to bring you closer to God? There are people walking around today who have everything the world tells them they need. They have success, they have wealth, they have prestige, but they are miserable. Why? Because they're missing the key ingredient. They've been working for themselves, for their own ambitions, for money, for status, but they have not been working for God. And when you work for anything other than God, you will always come up empty. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Some of you have felt that emptiness. You've worked hard, you've done everything you thought you were supposed to do, and yet at the end of the day you still feel restless. That's because God did not design work to be a punishment. He designed it to be a partnership. When God placed Adam in the Garden of Eden, He gave him work to do. Not as a curse, not as a burden, but as a blessing. Work was meant to be an act of service, a way for man to glorify God with his hands, with his mind, with his strength. But sin corrupted that. The fall of man made work seem like toil instead of worship. It made labor feel like suffering instead of service. And the world today continues to push that lie. It tells you that work is just a means to an end, that it has no deeper meaning. But friends, that is not what God says. The Bible tells us in Ecclesiastes 3:22, so I saw that there is nothing better for a person than to enjoy their work, because that is their lot. God wants you to find joy in your work. He wants you to see it as something greater than just a paycheck. I want you to imagine a man walking down the street late at night. He is tired, he is discouraged, and is wondering if anything he does in life really matters. He looks up at the sky and asks God, what is the purpose of all this? Why am I here? Maybe that man is you. Maybe you've asked that question before. But let me tell you, God sees you. He sees your labor. He sees your struggles. He sees your long hours and your tired hands. And He wants you to know your work is not in vain. So the question is not whether your work has meaning. The question is whether you will choose to see it. Will you choose to look at your work as a burden, or will you see it as a calling? Will you continue to drag yourself through the motions, or will you lift your head and say, Lord, I do this for you? Because when you work for God, when you dedicate your labor to Him, everything changes. The exhaustion turns into purpose. The frustration turns into fulfillment. The job you once dreaded becomes an opportunity to serve. And here's the beauty of it. When you work for God, you don't have to chase after success, because success will come to you. Maybe not in the way the world defines it, but in the way that truly matters. The world measures success in numbers, in money, in titles. But God measures success in faithfulness. And when you are faithful with what He has given you, whether it's sweeping floors or running a business, He will bless your labor. He will multiply your efforts. He will open doors you never thought possible. So the next time you wake up and ask yourself, is this all there is? Remember this. If your work is for God, then the answer is no, because when you work for God, there is always more. More meaning, more joy, more purpose, and that, my friends, is a truth worth holding on to. Some of you might be thinking, that sounds good, but you don't know my situation. You don't know how hard my job is. You don't know how tired I am. And you're right, I don't. But God does. He sees the long hours you put in, the sacrifices you make, the burdens you carry. He knows the weight on your shoulders, the exhaustion in your bones, the frustrations that build up day after day. And He is not distant from your struggles. He is right there with you, walking through them, carrying you when you feel like you can't take another step. But here's what I want you to understand. Your work is not just about what you do. It's about how you do it. It's about the heart behind your labor. You may feel stuck in a job that seems meaningless, but when you do that work with a heart that seeks to honor God, it becomes something more. It becomes an act of worship. It becomes a testimony. People around you will notice. They will see something different in you. While others complain, you will work with joy. While others cut corners, you will work with integrity. While others do the bare minimum, you will give your best. Not for a paycheck, not for approval, but because you know you are working for something greater. Think about Joseph in the Bible. He was sold into slavery, thrown into prison, treated unfairly time and time again. But what did he do? Did he sit in that prison cell and complain? Did he give up? No. He worked with excellence. He remained faithful in the small things. And because of that, God lifted him up in due time. Joseph didn't have to fight for a promotion. He didn't have to manipulate his way to success. God positioned him exactly where he needed to be because he remained faithful in every season. And the same is true for you. You may feel overlooked, you may feel underappreciated, but God is watching. He sees the late nights, the extra effort, the faithfulness when no one else does, and in His perfect timing, He will open the right doors. He will put you in the right place, not because you fought for it, but because you were faithful where you were. But the world doesn't tell you that, does it? The world tells you to chase success, to push ahead at all costs, to do whatever it takes to climb the ladder. But what happens when you get to the top and realize it's not enough? What happens when you reach your goal only to find that it still doesn't bring you peace? The truth is, if you build your life on the foundation of worldly success, it will always leave you empty. I've seen people who have everything the world tells them they need: money, power, influence. But they are miserable. They have reached the top, but they feel more lost than ever. And do you know why? Because they were working for themselves. Because they made their careers their God. Because they put their faith in their own strength. My friends, don't fall into that trap. Don't believe the lie that success is the goal. Faithfulness is the goal. Obedience is the goal. Doing what God has called you to do wherever He has placed you with excellence and integrity, that is the goal. And when you do that, He will take care of the rest. Some of you are waiting for God to open a new door, to give you a better job, to bring a change into your life. And maybe He will, but maybe He's asking you to be faithful where you are first. Maybe He's testing your heart, seeing if you will trust Him in the small things before He gives you something greater. The Bible says, whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. Luke 16:10. If you want to see God move in your life, start by being faithful with what He has already given you. Work with excellence, even when no one is watching. Work with integrity, even when it's hard. Work with joy, even when you don't feel like it. Because when you do, you are not just working for yourself, you are working for the Lord. And when you work for the Lord, your labor is never in vain. Some of you may still be thinking, but what if my work doesn't matter? What if what I do is too small, too insignificant for God to care about? My friends, let me tell you, there is no such thing as insignificant work when it is done for the Lord. Every task, every job, every moment of effort has meaning when it is given to Him. Look at Jesus himself. Before he ever preached a sermon, before he ever performed a miracle, he worked as a carpenter. He shaped wood with his hands, built things for people, labored in a small town where few knew his name, and yet that work was not beneath him. He did not rush through it or see it as a waste of time. No, he did it with care, with integrity, with excellence, because even in the quiet years, even in the unnoticed moments, he was fulfilling his Father's will. And if Jesus, the Son of God, could find purpose in everyday work, then so can you, whether you are working behind a desk, in a factory, at a hospital, on a construction site, or at home raising children. God sees you. He sees the work of your hands, and he is pleased when you do it with a heart that honors him. But the enemy wants to deceive you. He wants to whisper in your ear, this doesn't matter. No one sees what you do. No one appreciates your effort. Why even bother? And the moment you believe that lie, you begin to lose sight of your purpose. You start cutting corners, working with resentment, seeing your job as a burden instead of a blessing. But I am here to tell you, don't believe the lie. Don't let the enemy steal the joy of your labor. Some of you feel trapped in a job that seems mundane, and you're waiting for something bigger, something better. But let me tell you this, God often works in the waiting. He is shaping your character, teaching you patience, preparing you for what's next. Think of David. Before he became a king, he was a shepherd, tending sheep in the fields. It was lonely, it was thankless, but it was in those quiet fields that God prepared him for the throne. The battles he faced in the wilderness, the lions, the bears, were training for the battles he would one day face as a leader of a nation. And maybe that's what God is doing with you. Maybe this season of work you're in right now is not the end of your story, but the training ground for something greater. Maybe he is using the challenges, the struggles, and even the frustrations to mold you into the person he created you to be. And if you trust him, if you remain faithful in his perfect timing, he will move you forward. But here's the key. You cannot just work for a paycheck. You cannot just work for the weekend. You must work with the understanding that your labor is part of a bigger picture. Every person you interact with, every problem you solve, every bit of effort you put in is an opportunity to reflect Christ. You are not just an employee, you are an ambassador of the kingdom. You carry the light of Jesus wherever you go, even into the workplace. And the way you work speaks louder than any sermon you could ever preach. When you work with joy instead of bitterness, people notice. When you refuse to cut corners, people see your integrity. When you go the extra mile, not for recognition, but because you serve a higher purpose, people wonder what makes you different. And in that moment, your work becomes a witness. You don't have to stand on a street corner and shout about Jesus. Your life, your attitude, your work ethic will speak for itself. And God will use it. He will use your faithfulness to open doors, to impact lives, to bring his presence into places that might otherwise never hear his name. And one day you will stand before him and he will say, well done, my good and faithful servant. Not because of how much money you made, not because of how high you climbed the corporate ladder, but because you worked with excellence, because you remained faithful, because you understood that even the smallest task, when done for God, has eternal significance. So I ask you today, how will you see your work? Will you see it as a burden, something to endure until something better comes along? Or will you see it as an opportunity, a calling, a chance to glorify God in all that you do? Because when you shift your perspective, when you begin to see your labor as worship, everything changes. The stress, the frustration, the exhaustion, they no longer define your work. Instead, Your work becomes a mission field. It becomes a place where God moves. It becomes something far greater than you ever imagined. And when that happens, my friends, you will no longer feel lost in your labor, because you will know you are working for the King. Some of you may feel like you've been working hard for years, pushing forward, staying faithful, yet nothing seems to change. You've prayed for a breakthrough, for an opportunity, for recognition, but instead, it feels like you're stuck in the same place, doing the same thing with no end in sight. And in that waiting, doubt creeps in, frustration begins to take hold. You start to wonder, does God even see me? Does He care? Is my effort in vain? Let me tell you something. God sees you. Every long day, every late night, every sacrifice you've made, He has seen the times you chose integrity when it would have been easier to compromise. He has seen the moments you swallowed your frustration and kept pushing forward. He has seen your faithfulness when no one else noticed. And the world may not recognize it, your boss may not acknowledge it, but God does. And He is the one who holds your future. He is the one who determines your steps. Sometimes we get so caught up in wanting immediate results that we forget that God's timing is perfect. The story of Moses comes to mind. Moses was raised in the palace, trained in leadership, prepared for greatness. But instead of stepping into his calling immediately, he was sent into the wilderness for 40 years. 40 years tending sheep in the desert, away from the position he thought he was meant for. But what seemed like wasted time was actually preparation. God was shaping him, teaching him patience, refining his character. Because when the time was right, when Moses was ready, God called him to lead His people. And that's how God works. We may not always understand the delays, the seasons of waiting, the times when it feels like nothing is happening, but He is always at work. He is preparing you for something greater than you can imagine. The waiting is not wasted. The struggle is not meaningless. He is molding you, strengthening you, refining you, because what He has in store requires you to be ready. But while you wait, while you work, there is something important you must understand. Your worth is not found in your job title. Your identity is not defined by your career. The world will tell you that your value is based on how much money you make, how successful you are, how much power or influence you have, but that is not what God says. God says you are His child. You are loved, chosen, and created with purpose. And that purpose is not tied to a paycheck. It is not dependent on your position. When Jesus called His disciples, He didn't choose the rich, the powerful, the highly educated. He chose fishermen. He chose ordinary men who worked with their hands, who spent their days casting nets and laboring on the water. And yet those men who had no earthly status, became the ones through whom God changed the world. Not because of their skills or their social standing, but because they said yes to Him. And that is what He asks of you, to say yes, to trust Him in the work you are doing right now, to be faithful in the small things, knowing that He is working all things together for your good, to give your best, not for human approval, but because you are serving the Lord. Because at the end of the day, when this life is over, it won't matter how much money you made. It won't matter how many promotions you received. It won't matter how many awards or accolades you collected. The only thing that will matter is whether you lived your life in a way that honored God. Whether you worked with integrity, with faithfulness, with a heart that pointed others to Him. So don't grow weary. Don't let discouragement steal your joy. Don't allow the waiting to make you question your worth, because your work matters. Your faithfulness matters. And when you keep your eyes on God, when you trust His plan even when you don't understand it, He will guide you. He will open the right doors. He will take you places you never imagined. And one day when you look back, you will see every moment, every struggle, every season of waiting was leading you exactly where He wanted you to be. Some of you may be struggling with the idea that your work has meaning. You wake up every day, go through the motions, and at the end of it all, you wonder if any of it truly matters. You feel exhausted, drained, as if you're pouring yourself into something that offers little in return. The weight of daily life presses down on you, and in those quiet moments you ask yourself, is this all there is? Is this all I was made for? But let me tell you something today. Your work is not just about earning a paycheck. It is not just about surviving until the weekend. It is not just about getting through the day. No, your work is an act of worship. When you do it with the right heart, when you give your best, when you honor God in what you do, no matter how big or small the task, it becomes something sacred. Think about it. God himself is a worker. He created the heavens and the earth. He spoke light into existence, shaped the mountains, filled the seas. And when he was finished, he stepped back and called it good. And we, made in his image, are created to work as well. We are created to build, to create, to serve, to contribute, but not just for our own benefit, not just for material gain. We work because it reflects the one who made us. We work because through it, we can glorify God. But here's the danger. When we lose sight of why we work, when we forget who we are ultimately serving, work can become a burden. It can become something we resent, something that feels meaningless. The enemy wants to take what God designed for good and turn it into a source of frustration. He wants to fill your heart with bitterness, with exhaustion, with the lie that what you do doesn't matter. But the truth is, everything you do has purpose when you do it for the Lord. Maybe you feel unseen. Maybe you feel like the work you do is too small, too unimportant to matter in the grand scheme of things. But let me remind you of something. God sees everything. He sees the mother who stays up late taking care of her children. He sees the janitor who cleans the floors when no one is watching. He sees the employee who goes the extra mile, not for recognition, but because they want to do their job with excellence. He sees you. He sees your effort. And in his eyes, nothing done with a faithful heart is ever wasted. The Bible tells us in Colossians 3:23, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters. That means whether you are leading a company or sweeping the floor, whether you are preaching a sermon or stocking shelves, whether you are running a business or serving food, it all matters to God, because it is not about what you do, but about how you do it. And when you begin to see your work through that lens, everything changes. The job you once resented becomes an opportunity. The long hours, the difficult tasks, the unseen efforts, they all take on a new meaning when you recognize that you are not just working for a paycheck, but for a higher purpose. You are not just serving a company, but serving the Lord. And when you work with that kind of mindset, your work becomes a testimony. Because the world is watching. The people around you are watching. They see how you handle stress, how you respond to difficulty, how you treat others. And when they see you working with joy instead of bitterness, with integrity instead of compromise, with faith instead of fear, they will wonder what makes you different. And in that moment, your life, your work becomes a reflection of Christ. So do not let the struggles of today make you forget the purpose behind your labor. Do not let exhaustion or frustration steal your joy. God is using you where you are, even if you cannot see it yet. He is working through you, shaping you, preparing you for what's next. And if you remain faithful, if you give your best, if you trust Him in every season, He will bless the work of your hands. And one day when you stand before Him, He will not ask how much money you made, how high you climbed, or how many achievements you collected. He will ask if you were faithful. He will ask if you honored Him in the work you were given. And for those who did, He will say, "Well done, my good and faithful servant." Because that, my friends, is the true reward. That is what makes all the work worth it.